You must have heard of conflict in Ukraine. The West calls it war on Ukraine by Russia. Sometimes they use the name Putin, the president of Russian Federation, also calling it the Putin war. We are not discussing that in detail, though there are multiple sides to the issue. And issue is not old. The Crimea was taken in 2014, and many areas in the east of Ukraine, uh, people living are Russian ethnic people who had been pressurized, murdered, their language taken away, etc., etc. And Russia had been persuading EU, USA, etc., even UN, that should not be done. However, since that is not the major topic of this discussion, the major topic is sanctions and impact of sanctions on India and other countries which have been sanctioned. We are not very familiar with this topic in India because we have neither been subjected to serious sanctions except when we had the atomic um, uh, bomb which was exploded when US and European countries had put sanctions on us as well as on Pakistan. So let's proceed. Oil is really the king commodity, even more than the gold, because if you look at the total transaction in a year, it crosses $1 trillion. Um, though initially found in US, the major finds were there in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, and so on. But there are more than 48 countries which produce oil and about 3 dozen which produce gas. And gas is the cleaner fuel, as we know. The difference is that most of the time gas is um, transported by pipelines. Now, Russia, once it found out gas in large quantities in Siberia in the 50s, developed a huge extraction facilities as well as put up pipes at its own cost, turning into 1500 miles, 2000 miles, 2500 miles to Europe. There are four major pipes, and two of which were blasted, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, in September of 22. Now, the Ukraine conflict, military-wise, started on 22nd February, and the Western countries started putting the sanctions. The latest is that EU has put 10th round of sanctions on Russia. Now, these included blocking the funds of some major people, asking their companies from Russia to withdraw. These included the oil companies, disrupting them, stopping supply of semiconductors or any other materials which might go uh, towards making military equipment, so-called dual purpose equipment. That is military as well as civilian uses. Um, so there were initial thrust was there, and the Russian army was near the capital Kiev, but they kind of withdrew from there because the purpose was not to acquire the country, the purpose was to defend their own Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. But meanwhile, the Europe started upping the battle. However, European countries were quite dependent on the Russian gas to the extent of 40% of supplies, and the largest manufacturing nation in Europe, Germany, uh, had dependence up to 60%. It was also relatively inexpensive gas. And the background of that is in the 70s, Willy Brandt, the Chancellor of Germany, uh, talking to Khrushchev, um, developed osteoporic, that means shaking the hands. And for that reason, Russia had made major investments, and lots of the industry got hooked to using gas for production. Now, slowly, the European Union, to put pressure on Russia, started putting sanctions, and they first said, okay, we will even blast your pipes away, which was a kind of illegal act. because it was of a private company in which 50% share was of um, Russia, and another 50% was of five Western companies. It is alleged that the US, along with Norway, may have done this dastardly task when so many million tons of methane gas escaped to the atmosphere and also mixed with the seawater. Uh, Let it be as it may, giving approximate figures, the total business in a year is of the order of 100 billion barrels, sorry, 100 million barrels per day, hmm, out of which um, Russia has about 20% share, Saudi Arabia has about 20% share, other Middle Eastern countries have about 20% share, and 40% is by the rest of the countries, Iran, Iraq, Venezuela. Incidentally, all of them also sanctioned by the US and the West so that they cannot sell what all they can produce. Uh, and Consumption wise, of course, US, China, and India are the top three consuming nations. India used to and still does import about 5 million barrels per day, MBD, and the share of Russia was relatively small, but that does not matter because the US, the Indian companies and the government go out to buy wherever they can get their grades of oil cheaper than elsewhere. So that has increased now as of February end to 20% of the imports. So, to be exact, it is 16 lakh barrels per day in February, which is imported from Russia. From Iraq, the volume has gone down to 9.4 lakh barrels per day. Saudi Arabia, 6.5, UAE, 4 lakhs, and USA, 2.5 lakh. In USA, though, the production and consumption are somewhat balanced, but they also import and export because again it depends on the grades as well as the refined products may be imported sometimes, and India is acquiring a position in the refined products because of all these things. Because the sanctions are now on crude oil, but they are not on refined oil if the country of origin changes. Say, for example, from the Ural Mountains, Russia, the oil comes to Bombay, it gets refined and it goes to Germany, let's say, Netherlands. Then there is no restriction on that. Of course, Europe has also put restrictions on shipping and logistics and price, that no Russian oil of a particular grade called Ural grade can be sold for more than $65 per barrel, though the market price is anywhere between $5 to $20 more. This is just to hurt the Russian economy so that they don't get sufficient, because the cost of production is also quite high. Conditions are very difficult in Siberia, the distances are long, and ships are special, including they have icebreakers, nuclear powered icebreakers, to be able to go through the Arctic and deliver these things. It is not easy. It's one of the toughest terrains in the world. Now let's note, sometimes the figures are given in tons. Not to get confused, 1 ton of oil can be taken as 7.4 barrels of oil, and BPD means barrels per day. So during February 23, imports from Russia exceeded that from Saudi Arabia and Iraq. The situation was different in the February 22, when Iraq was number one, Saudi Arabia was number two, and Russia was fourth or fifth, though India imported from 24 different countries at that time, small quantities. However, these are daily averages and not consumption figures, and can vary month on month due to different factors, including logistics and storage capacities. Since the shipping of the oil also came under sanction, Russia bought about 100 uh, um, vessels, uh, repaired them, etc., etc. And the West and the Western companies, which are in shipping, call them rust buckets or dark ships or things of that sort, just to put it down. However, they are doing their job, and Russia has more or less, despite the sanctions on them, been able to transport as well as insure those consignments. Now we will discuss other types of sanctions which can make a difference. US in between had to put diplomatic pressure on India, said that there may be secondary sanctions on India too if they buy these things from um, Russia. But the Indian foreign minister had clearly said that Russia supplies to India in 1 week, which uh, which the euro buys in one afternoon. So, who are they to tell us? This is hypocrisy. They continue to buy, they continue to buy, they use it for storage purposes, but they were telling the rest of the world not to buy it. Yes, they reduced their purchases from Russia. Yes, the sales to India, China, and a number of other developing nations have increased from Russia, but they have not been able to stop the flows coming from Russia. If they were, then the prices would have shot up, and actually in the end the common man would have suffered. So the other type of sanctions are to punish the countries and individuals generally rich and powerful. So economic sanctions don't emanate from any UN or WTO regulations. These are countries like US which in their own Congress pass a law, and if they're not happy with somebody, they put these restrictions on human beings. Uh, uh, they freeze their assets. Now, earlier the richer people and the companies used to put their assets in dollars in the US banks or the European banks for safety purposes. Dollar is a convertible currency. But more and more, the elite people in the developing world are taking their dollars out. And there is a movement now called de-dollarization. I don't go into exact numbers there. And also slowly impacting the role of dollar as um, the reserve currency, because Saudi Arabia has started taking renminbi, um, Russia has started taking rubles. There is trade of India with Sri Lanka and Sri Lankan rupees, yuan with China, and so on. So people are slowly edging away from the dollar because of sanctions of this kind and freezing all the assets of the companies as well as of the individuals. But let's look at a few figures before the Ukraine conflict and after the Ukraine conflict. We will talk about it in uh, round numbers. Russia is the maximum. Before the Ukraine conflict was 2,750 persons who were individually sanctioned by name and the companies, um, and which has increased to 11,300, over 4 times. Iran was 3,600 at that time maximum, and now is 4,200. Syria was 2,600 at that time, number two. Now it's about the same, 2,650. Now you will realize that Iran and Syria both were invaded by USA, basically to capture their oil assets, uh, and not for any philosophical reasons. Then next is North Korea, about 2000, same about 2100 now. Belarus, which is openly favoring Russia for the Ukraine conflict and is on the border in Europe, 1150 or so numbers are there now. Myanmar, Burma, 1150. Now, many of you may not know where does the name Burma Shell comes from. It was Burma Oil Company first. Burma was Burma, our Burma, our neighbor Burma. It was part of the Indian subcontinent, which was managed by the British. And the oil in this region of the world has actually emanated first from Burma. Hmm? So again, there is an army rule there, and they want to capture the oil assets, etc., etc. The problems come, so they have gone ahead and sanctioned all these people. Venezuela, 650 people. Now Venezuela is hardly producing any oil now. If there was a quiz to say which is the country which has the largest deposits of oil, well, as of now it is Venezuela. So Venezuela, such large quantities of oil are lying unutilized, and because of which the prices in the market are high. Therefore, the US companies, the Middle East companies, the other companies which extract oil make so much money that it is unbelievable. But Venezuela remains under the sanctions. So sanctions are not straightforward things. There is a lot of politics behind it. There is a lot of economics behind it. So in total, USA imposes, you'll be surprised, economic sanctions on 40 countries, and this is without any law. So we will close it on this because as I said, we are not discussing all the issues in one session, and these keep on developing. But despite 10 rounds of sanctions on Russia, Russia has more or less managed it. Its economy is not that bad as it was expected to be because there is a resilience, and there has been uh, out of proportion support from the global north, the developing countries, India. So X number of countries may vote in UN in particular fashion, but they say, well, there is a lot of pressure from the West, therefore they voted. But 35 people abstained on the UN General Council meeting to criticize Russia. And Russia has its own story to tell. Why, for so many years after the agreements which were broken, that they had been persuading that this sort of thing should not be done with the ethnic Russians there and so on and so forth, and nothing happened, and tens of thousands of people died also, that they had to take this action. And if you go into the details of actions, if the, if Russia wanted, they could have really run over the country, but the cost of that would have been a lot of human beings. And all the West is giving weapons, etc., etc., but they are promises. When they come, when they will come, when they will not come, and all that. While Russia is well equipped and produces its own weapons, therefore, and has no shortage because it has promised now from China also as a friendship treaty. However, any war is a bad war. We all pray for peace, but in this overall, India has benefited because Ukraine, which is also a bread basket, largest wheat producer in the Europe, its supplies got affected, so India was able to supply wheat and stopped it in between because our own prices went up, but then again started doing it. People appreciated it. Fertilizers, same thing, because when the gas gets disrupted, it's also a production raw material. So um, they, the fertilizer prices went up. So overall, the food security went down quite substantially. And if you look at the cost, we will not go into details now, that approximately $1 trillion loss has been there in Russia because of stoppage of factories, withdrawal of factories, things not being available to run even the oil industry well, and a number of other industries well, aluminium, etc., etc. And so that is a substantial loss to the economy. But loss to European Union has been about $1 trillion in terms of subsidies, 800 billion, not million, 800 billion dollars equivalent for subsidizing the consumers and the factories because prices went up 3 to 4 times, 5 times, and about $200 billion odd has been other out-of-pocket expenses, including supporting the Ukraine refugees and the Ukraine war machine. USA has given $200 billion, and plus there is a lot of non-calculated military aid there. So we are talking about $2.5 trillion of the economy loss. This is almost close to the GDP of India. Uh, but of course, the loss of the human life is much more, and it just shows that the equations in any conflict should remain such that there should be a possibility of negotiated settlement, diplomatic settlement, and so on.